Good day, I am Christian Paras from BSEd English 2 of CTU Barili Campus, and in this video I will be giving a brief summary of Jane Austen's most famous work, Pride and Prejudice. Socioeconomic status plays a big role in defining who we are and how people will treat us here in the Philippines. But back in the days, back in 19th century England, socioeconomic status was everything. If you are born to a family who is located below the hierarchy, chances are the quality of life you will be living will not be great. People will not be treating you well. Plus, the privilege of moving up, or the chances of moving up the ladder, will be so difficult because back in the days, education wasn't for free. And the only way to move up the ladder was to marry someone who is already up there. In other words, it was to marry someone who is wealthy. Now, the idea of marrying for wealth is such a contradiction to how we view marriage nowadays. Because today, we marry for love. We marry someone we love, whereas back in the days, they marry to improve the quality of life they are living and to move up and to climb higher in the social hierarchy. The story begins with the introduction of the Bennet family, a family composed of course, a mother, a father, and 5 daughters. Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet, Jane being the eldest, followed by Elizabeth, followed by Mary, followed by Catherine, and then Lydia. The Bennet family is a family that is located below the social ladder, meaning that they are not rich, they are poor. And the story moves on as the mother tries to convince her daughter to marry someone who is wealthy so that they will live a better quality of life. The Bennet family's adventure begins when a news resonated about 2 wealthy men coming to town for a ball. They were Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. These 2 men are well famous in England for their wealth and their estate. Now, the mother, wanting to move up the social ladder, convinced his daughter, namely his 2 eldest daughters, Jane and Elizabeth, to try to marry these 2 men when they will be at the ball. They need to look as attractive as possible and they need to interact with them in order to make them fall in love. So the day came when Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy finally arrived in town, and then the ball started. Mr. Bingley was of course a man of wealth and of course a man of good character. But Mr. Darcy, also a man of wealth, was perceived to be a proud one. He had a character that is very silent, and whenever he speaks, the words that he usually talks are hurting words. As the night continues, Jane made a special bond with Mr. Bingley, whom he paired with dancing at the ball, while Elizabeth was a bit unfortunate because she couldn't get Mr. Darcy to dance with him. Mr. Darcy refused because she refused to interact with strangers, while Jane, on the other hand, delighted in his experience with Mr. Bingley, and we could even say that a spark of love happened in between them. So, in short, at the end of the night, Jane and Mr. Bingley's relationship had high hopes, while Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth's were going south, and it seemed impossible to work out between the 2 of them. The next day, while the Bennet sisters were at the market, they encountered another character by the name of Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham was a soldier, a young one, handsome of course, and of good physique. But the most notable thing about Mr. Wickham is his character. He seemed to have good character, and as the day progresses, it so happened that Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham got to talk to each other beside a river under a tree. During that experience, it so happened also that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley came by in horseback. Elizabeth noticed that when Mr. Darcy saw Mr. Wickham, he immediately avoided and somewhat avoiding a confrontation. There, she perceived that there was bad blood between Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy, of whom he asked Mr. Wickham about them, if they knew each other and if there were conflicts between them. Mr. Wickham confirmed that yes, there was a conflict between them because Mr. Wickham was once an adopted child of Mr. Darcy's father, whom, when Mr. Darcy's father was about to die, gave an inheritance to Mr. Wickham, but Mr. Wickham claimed that Mr. Darcy cheated on him because he was jealous and instead took the inheritance to his own, and then Mr. Wickham then became a lowly soldier. When Elizabeth arrived at home, there happened another introduction of a character, which is Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins was a distant cousin of them who was said to inherit their house when Mr. Bennet would die, meaning that once the Bennet's father would die, they would have no other place to live, and they would be just roaming around the streets and looking for a new home. This was such a huge news because Mr. Collins said that in order for them to remain in the house when Mr. Bennet will die, he will have to marry one of the Bennet sisters, which, as the story progresses, we will find out that Mr. Collins has interest in Jane. Unfortunately, when Mr. Collins asked Mrs. Bennet if he could marry Jane, Mrs. Bennet refused because she told Mr. Collins that Mrs. Bennet is already engaged to Mr. Bingley, which was such a better man compared to Mr. Collins in terms of wealth and in terms of character. So, the two of them agreed that the next eldest sister would be the one that Mr. Collins would marry, in this case being Elizabeth. However, when Mr. Collins proposed to Elizabeth, Elizabeth refused because she doesn't like the man, which ultimately set her mother enraged because her mother badly wanted her to marry Mr. Collins in order for them to remain in the house when Mr. Bennet will die. As the story progresses, we will discover that Mr. Bennet supported Elizabeth in her decision to not marry Mr. Collins at all because her father is not a man who wants her daughters to marry because of wealth or because it's the choice of others, but rather he is a man who wants his daughters to marry for love and for the choice of their own. As the days passed, a news came that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley will be going back to their home city, ultimately leaving the Bennet's hometown and never to come back. This saddened the Bennet family because Jane had high hopes in terms of making out or having a good relationship or ultimately marrying Mr. Bingley, and they could climb up the social ladder and live a better life. So this was such a sad news that even Mrs. Bennet, when she heard this, felt terrible and did all that she could in order for Jane and Mr. Bingley's relationship to work out. Thus, they had an idea that Jane would follow Mr. Bingley in a carriage, riding in a carriage and going to his house and continuing the relationship that they started back at the ball. So, it happened that Jane followed Mr. Bingley to his home city, and Elizabeth with her other three sisters remained in the house. Then, while Elizabeth was alone at the hammock, another news came. It was from her best friend named Charlotte. It was such a good news for Charlotte, as Charlotte said that she will be getting married. And Charlotte also came from a family that is poor. Or we could say that Charlotte came from a family that is poorer than the Bennets. So when Charlotte said that she will be married with a man who can provide for her, this was such a good news. But when Elizabeth discovered that this man is Mr. Collins, she was shocked, and she told Charlotte that no, this can't happen. You can't marry Mr. Collins. He's a terrible man, and I know her. He's a distant cousin of mine. But ultimately, Charlotte prevailed in this argument when she said the line that not everyone can afford to be a romantic, meaning that if you're not rich, you can't afford to be a romantic. sometimes you just need to be practical and marry not for love but for stability. So, as the story continues, we now, the information that we have now gathered is that Jane went to follow Mr. Bingley, and Charlotte, Elizabeth's best friend, is now married to Mr. Collins. As time passes by, the day came when Elizabeth would visit Charlotte to see what will be the situation of her marrying Mr. Collins. It was such a surprise because what she found out was that Mr. Collins was such a good man, and that Charlotte was now living the life that she ever dreamed. She was now stable in terms of food, she had a good house, and Mr. Collins was ultimately a good husband who worked for her, and not just worked, but worked hard for her. It was such a good choice that Charlotte decided to marry Mr. Collins, because ultimately the results were positive. In Elizabeth's visit as Charlotte, she was introduced to Lady Catherine by Mr. Collins. Lady Catherine is also a wealthy person who is known for her very high standards in terms of socio-economic status. When Elizabeth met Lady Catherine immediately scrutinized her if she was worthy to be in the house. She asked her of her educational status, of her economic status, of her talents, like was she good at art, was she good at music, and even Lady Catherine convinced her to play the piano in order to test if she was at all worthy to be in the house. During dinner, it was evident that that Elizabeth was not a person of high socioeconomic status, as she didn't even know the proper manners of eating at the table, which is being, if you are in partner with a boy, if you're a girl and you have a boy as your partner, you shouldn't sit next to him, but rather you should sit across the table facing him. During Elizabeth's stay at Lady Catherine's, she discovered something surprising. She discovered that Mr. Darcy was there. Whoa, what a surprise, right? Mr. Darcy was there because Mr. Darcy is Lady Catherine's nephew. There they interacted for a bit, and was ultimately things weren't working out for them, as Mr. Darcy's pride would just overcome any positive experience with him. The next day, while they were at the church, while Elizabeth was at the church, she sat next to Mr. Darcy's bodyguard, and the bodyguard talked about how good Mr. Darcy is, while Elizabeth, of course, refuted him with the things that he experienced with Mr. Darcy. Ultimately, the bodyguard prevailed in their argument, as the bodyguard told Elizabeth of a story of how Mr. Darcy saved his friend Mr. Bingley from a terrible marriage, which of course, upon hearing, Elizabeth was shocked, because what marriage? Who? And then during the conversation, Elizabeth ultimately found out that it was Mr. Darcy who separated Mr. Bingley and Jane. It was Mr. Darcy who convinced Mr. Bingley to move out of the Bennet's hometown in order for Mr. Bingley to not marry Jane. This information ultimately angered Elizabeth, because how could Mr. Darcy do such thing? Mr. Bingley and Jane getting married was their only chance to rise up the socio-economic ladder. But then Mr. Darcy ruined it for them. Before the conversation even formally ended, Elizabeth went out of the church and ran into the woods and cried. While Elizabeth was crying in, I think it was an abandoned building, it was raining as well, and suddenly Mr. Darcy came to her, and Mr. Darcy was talking about things that Elizabeth couldn't understand, but Elizabeth just murmured about how could Mr. Darcy do such thing? How could he, first of all, stole Mr. Wickham's inheritance from him, And the next thing is, how could Mr. Darcy ruin Jane and Mr. Bingley's relationship, which was their only chance to rise up the socio-economic ladder? Mr. Darcy didn't give any response, and when Jane said, when Elizabeth said, "I don't understand," Mr. Darcy just said that, "I love you." And after that, Elizabeth was shocked, like, how could she love me? How could he say that he loved me when these are the things that he did, when he's such a terrible person? So ultimately, the thing that is keeping their relationship from working was Mr. Darcy's pride and Elizabeth's prejudice of Mr. Darcy being a terrible person. After that, when Elizabeth went home at Charlotte's, the next morning, she received a letter from Mr. Darcy. It was a letter of explanation in which Mr. Darcy explained to Elizabeth what really happened between him and Mr. Wickham, as well as why Mr. Darcy devised a plan in order to separate Mr. Bingley and Jane. It was clearly explained, and Elizabeth got his point. Elizabeth understood. To keep things short, Elizabeth went home, and when she went home, it so happened that his aunt and uncle came to the Bennet's house in order to visit, and they decided that they will go out for a walk. And when they did, they decided to visit Mr. Darcy's house, which was near the place where they were already going. So when they visited Mr. Darcy's house, there they encountered that the house was so grand, the house was so epic, as you know what a wealthy man would possess. And during that experience, Elizabeth get to meet Mr. Darcy, get to know him a bit more, and she also met Mr. Darcy's sister, which was so passionate about playing the piano. And Mr. Darcy's sister loved Elizabeth. She liked Elizabeth's personality, and they get along well. After that, while Elizabeth was still at Mr. Darcy's residence, a sudden news came, which was so horrifying, because they heard that Lydia, the youngest among all the sisters, has been abducted by Mr. Wickham. So it was such a terrible news, because as Mr. Darcy explained in his letter, Mr. Wickham is a terrible guy, and he is a guy that you shouldn't be with. Later on, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy planned to rescue Lydia from Mr. Wickham, and of course Mr. Darcy, being a wealthy man and a man of power, decided that he will help Elizabeth in the search by using how many men that he could, and to find Lydia and Mr. Wickham, and ultimately fix everything and return Lydia back to the Bennets. When Elizabeth returned home, she found out that Lydia and Mr. Wickham were already married. Like, she was shocked to know that, wow, I thought that this was what happened and this was this, but it turns out everything went well between them, and Lydia loved Mr. Wickham, and Mr. Wickham loves Lydia as well. And based on what Mr. Darcy told about Mr. Wickham, that he is a terrible man, it was then, Elizabeth's prejudice of Mr. Wickham was then refuted, because based on the experience, Mr. Wickham was such a good man after all. Mr. Wickham was well-mannered and ultimately not a rich man, but a man of a stable job. He was a soldier. Then, Mr. Wickham and Lydia decided to move out of the family in order to start their own family, because Mr. Wickham was reassigned to another place. Before Lydia and Mr. Wickham go, Elizabeth talked to Lydia a while about why did he leave why did she fell in love with Mr. Wickham, and what happened between their marriage. How did Mr. Wickham afford to pay for a marriage when back in the days only the wealthy people could afford to marry. But it was also surprising because Lydia told Elizabeth that the one who funded their marriage was Mr. Darcy. So again, there was a shocking slap in Elizabeth's prejudice about Mr. Darcy. Like, Mr. Darcy told her that he would do everything in his power in order to stop Mr. Wickham and Lydia from marrying each other, but it turns out that he was the one who funded their marriage. To keep things short and simple, it so happened that Jane and Elizabeth were already home at the Bennet's residence, and what happened was time just passed and they were just living their ordinary and normal lives, when one ordinary day, they saw two men looming in the windows and going near to their house. When they discovered that it was Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, immediately the Bennet family were scrambling around, trying to clean the house, trying to make themselves look decent in front of the two wealthy men. And when the time came that they knocked on their doors, of course they welcomed the two men, and it was so shocking because Mr. Bingley proposed to Jane, and Jane said yes, and it was such a dream come true for the Bennet as well as to Jane, because Jane not only loved Mr. Bingley for his wealth but also for who he is as a person, and also we could say that Mr. Bingley loved Jane for who she is as a person, because as what she said in the movie, she loves Jane because she's beautiful. Not just because she's beautiful, but because of her character, which is she was witty, she was good-humored, and all sorts of positive characteristics. During their visit, it was such a good news for Jane because finally she was proposed of a man, and it was not just a man but a man that she loves. But it was not so good for Miss Elizabeth because she didn't get to talk to or to interact with Mr. Darcy during that visit, and again she wonders if Mr. Darcy really likes her as what Mr. Darcy said, because Mr. Darcy's actions just didn't say so. So, as days go by, one evening, another knock on the door was heard, and when the Bennet came to attend to that knock, they discovered that it was Lady Catherine. During this night, Lady Catherine was full of rage. She was so angry that she called for the attention of Miss Elizabeth immediately, and she wants to talk to her in private. There, in their conversation, Lady Catherine was full of rage that she told Elizabeth that about the news that she heard about Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy being engaged. Lady Catherine just doesn't want that to happen because, as what she described, Elizabeth is a person of inferior birth. Thus, she just can't marry someone who is greater in terms of socioeconomic status than her. Then, to make the conversation short, in the end, Elizabeth confirmed that she is not engaged to Mr. Darcy at all, and when she finally had enough of all the insults and all the bad treatments that Lady Catherine did to her, she also said out of anger that Lady Catherine needs to leave the house. After that horrible experience with Lady Catherine, we could say that Elizabeth, of course, wasn't happy with what happened. She was very sad, and the next morning, early in the morning, she went out the house and she went into the fogs, and when she was there alone and being sad, surprisingly, Mr. Darcy came and told her of how he feels, and in the end of the conversation, Mr. Darcy unexpectedly proposed to her, which of course Elizabeth said yes, because at that time she was already in love with Mr. Darcy due to all of the surprises that she encountered, and the way that her prejudice about Mr. Darcy just got slapped, it made her fell in love with Mr. Darcy even more. After Elizabeth's conversation with Mr. Darcy, after of course Mr. Darcy's proposal, the next thing that Elizabeth did was to ask permission from his father of whether she could marry Mr. Darcy. At first, her father refused because it is for a fact that her father knew how Elizabeth hated Mr. Darcy for Mr. Darcy's pride, for Mr. Darcy's character. But then suddenly Elizabeth would now want to marry Mr. Darcy. So Mr. Bennet was confused. But when Elizabeth told Mr. Bennet of all the experiences that she had and all the realizations that she had about Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bennet understood and was shocked that Elizabeth was now in love, and he was at full support because in the first place Mr. Bennet didn't just want her daughters to marry for wealth or to marry someone that they don't like. Mr. Bennet wants his daughters to marry for love and to marry for someone whom they truly want to be. And Mr. Bennet saw this happen to Elizabeth when Elizabeth asked permission to her. She discovered that Elizabeth was truly in love and thus supports her for it. The final scene of the story was Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy talking to each other in the most sweetest manner, in the most sweetest words possible. The story basically ended with Mr. Darcy calling Elizabeth Mrs. Darcy, and so they lived happily ever after. So that was Pride and Prejudice in a brief summary. The story's plot, its twist, basically revolves around Mr. Darcy's pride, or like his bad character, and Elizabeth's prejudice of him, which is being a bad character, which was of course resolved in the end that Mr. Darcy wasn't at all any proud, and Elizabeth's prejudice of him were entirely wrong. What do you think of Pride and Prejudice? Did you find the story interesting? Did you find the plot and the twists very exciting and very surprising? Well, let me know down in the comment section if you did. And once again, this is Christian Paras from BS Ed English 2 of CTU Barili Campus, giving you a brief summary of Jane Austen's famous work, Pride and Prejudice. Now I'm going to end this video with my favorite line from the story, which is, "We are all fools in love."